Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research, and their experiences. So, put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to The Sociology Show. The Sociology Show podcast is brought to you in association with Tutor2You Sociology, the exam performance specialist for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. And so you can visit the website, which is tutor2you.net/sociology, and there you can pick up revision guides, flashcards, revision videos, and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And so on to this episode, and my guest is Professor Michael Rosino. Michael, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. And you're about 5 hours behind where I am at the moment. I think that's right, isn't it?
Yeah. That's. I'm glad we were finally able to figure out a time that works for both of us. This is the issue with time zones.
Thank you. And sorry if I got you up too early, getting you up out of bed, Michael.
No worries.
Thank you. Do you mind start by telling us a little bit about who you are, what you do?
Absolutely. So I am an assistant professor of sociology at Molloy College, which is in Rockville, Center, New York. I am a sociologist. This is actually my first year as an assistant professor, but I have been studying sociology for about a decade now, teaching and doing research in some capacity, mostly as a graduate student. At the University of Connecticut. I just completed my PhD last spring, which was, as I'm sure a lot of you can imagine, a pretty interesting time to be doing a dissertation defense. One of the benefits of that was that I was able to wear comfortable pajama shorts while I was defending. Usually it's a very formal activity, so that was kind of nice that I could be comfy and be at home. But my research predominantly focuses on racial politics and kind of how racial politics, particularly in the United States, extends out into a few different areas, ranging from grassroots democracy and grassroots political organizations, everyday life and how inequality takes place in everyday life, as well as issues that relate to mass media. My most recent work, I just published a book on how racial politics and mass media have impacted the debate around drug policy in the United States. So those are kind of my main areas of focus, and I tend to be a pretty eclectic sociologist, but broadly around racial politics.
I'm always interested, Michael, as to why people specialise in a certain area. Was there something in particular that brought you to such an interest in racial politics?
Yeah, I think for me, I've always been really interested in politics, and I was that annoying kid growing up who liked to have conversations about really contentious political issues. So, when I was in high school, I'm probably aging myself a bit, but I would get into debates with my friends or conversations about everything from like the Iraq War to, all types of different policy issues, human rights issues. I've always just been really fascinated with, I think, two major questions. One is, why do people do the things that they do? And why is it that we have such persistent and pernicious problems that we seem to fail to, as collectively as human beings, address and solve? And I think as I began to look further into it, particularly as I decided to pursue sociology in college and even understanding, what sociology is, I became really fascinated by the fact that sociologists are out there using research, using data, using the scientific method to try to answer some of these questions that I've just thought, hey, this is just a conversation that you can have. People just have opinions about it. as I began to really even get further down the rabbit hole of sociology, so to speak, racial politics in particular became kind of a topic that I think cross-cuts all of these other issues. I think that racialized political inequality is one of the major issues that undermines democracy. I think that the issues with undermining democracy in a society lead to us being unable to address a lot of other related issues. And I think racial politics, particularly around issues of policy, broadly speaking, how much influence people have, we continue to see the role that it plays in maintaining not only systems of oppression, but also some really major areas of social problems that affect us broadly, whether it is anything from climate change to COVID-19 and access to vaccines, or, the wealth gap. So I've really come to see, particularly in the United States, that this intersection between racism, racial inequality, and politics is just a fundamental nexus that impacts all these other areas of society. And I think more people, fortunately, are paying attention to that in the current age.
Yeah, undoubtedly. And what about your own upbringing, Michael? Did you grow up in a culturally diverse, multicultural kind of city or area?
I actually have kind of an interesting upbringing that I think has given me a lot of useful insight for a few different reasons. I grew up in a predominantly white, pretty much rural suburb, kind of in the middle of nowhere in the Midwest of the United States in Ohio. I grew up with a pretty, class diverse sort of group of friends. So, I had some friends who, when I was in middle school and high school, I guess in the UK, maybe you'd call it primary school, that, were relatively not well off. I had friends who were upper middle class. I had friends who lived in trailer parks and, weren't super well off financially, or who were working class or in poverty. And so that kind of gave me a pretty interesting sense of the relationship between social class and just different tastes and habits and attitudes. So I definitely remember in college when I read the work of Pierre Bourdieu, where he talks about cultural capital and how class socialization impacts people's tastes and habits. That really clicked for me. But also, when I went to high school, I was labeled as a gifted student, and obviously there's a lot of inequalities and privilege that relates to the tracking system in the United States. I myself am white, so, I'm sure that impacted my likelihood of being seen as a gifted student at the time, coming from, a middle class background. And going to a private school in high school actually exposed me to a lot of other interesting things that led to a lot of other questions. First of all, I was around young people who were extremely well off because it was a private school. In the United States, private schools are more likely dedicated to people who can afford them. So we kind of have a unique education system in the United States. So a lot of my students that I was going to school with were extremely wealthy, and I noticed a whole different set of tastes and habits that related to social class. Also, a lot of them were first or second generation, mostly second generation immigrants who were coming predominantly from Asia and the Middle East. And so there was also a lot of cultural diversity there in terms of learning about various types of cultures, learning about the experiences of second-generation immigrants and how that impacted the expectations of their families, how that impacted their lived experience in terms of having unique cultural practices. And I think all of these different kind of moments of being around different types of people and really being curious, I think that really fed into a lot of questions that through sociology I was able to answer. So it really got me fascinated both in terms of inequality broadly, but also in terms of questions of how people make sense of the world and how people make sense of their place in the world. So I think having those kind of unique experiences was pretty helpful to me.
Yeah. I always think establishing your kind of own experiences and how that shapes your own views of the sociological world, that's really, really important. So, Michael, you mentioned your new book has just come out. Is that right?
Yeah, actually, it just came out. I'm not sure when this is coming out, but it came out on the 17th of March.
Brilliant. And so it's about drug policy in the US. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about it, how it got started, what the focus is, etc.?
Absolutely. So this is actually a project that I've been working on for quite some time, and it's probably been in the making for, I want to say, maybe about 6 or 7 years. This is a project that I kind of conceived quite a while ago. But just to give listeners a sense of that sociological research can be a really slow process, especially if you want to do it well. So this is a project where essentially I had for a long time really been thinking about the debate about drug policy in the United States. I think a lot of people grow up and they kind of struggle to make sense of, questions of, why is this substance allowed? Why is this substance not allowed? I think a lot of the questions that people grapple with, I think growing up are like, the difference between how alcohol and cannabis or tobacco are treated, for instance, I think doesn't always sit right with a lot of people. And so I became kind of fascinated with the history of drug policy in terms of why do we have the drug policies that we have if they don't necessarily follow some objective standard all the time in terms of harm reduction or in terms of, following the best available research or evidence. Why do we have these schedules? Why is there a global drug prohibition that's taken place? And then also, these burgeoning movements to reform drug policies across the world that have been taking shape. So, in a lot of countries, cannabis has recently been legalized. A lot of drugs have been decriminalized. In the United States, Oregon recently passed a law to decriminalize all drug use, which I think is really fascinating. And so what I wanted to look at is what are the conversations, what are the public debates that have shaped our drug policies in the United States? What is this broader debate and what does it look like? And how has it led to these specific outcomes that I think can be somewhat non-intuitive or paradoxical? And once again, this is a space where I began to really identify the role of racial politics, the history of racial inequality in the United States, and specifically racialized moral panics. And I was actually just on Twitter this morning as I was kind of waking up, and I saw that you have a show coming out that's looking at moral panics. So I don't want to spoil it too much, but maybe if people have already listened to that one. I draw pretty heavily on the work of Stuart Hall and Stanley Cohen. And I really think, and I think a lot of other scholars have argued this, every drug prohibition policy in the history of the United States specifically has been not just associated with a moral panic, an intense, almost irrational, outstated fear of some type of substance or behavior related to everything from cocaine to heroin to cannabis, but also that these are racialized moral panics. They're deeply embedded with racial meaning. They're deeply tied to systems of racial oppression and inequality. So even going back to the first drug laws in the United States, all the way back in 1875, in San Francisco, the first drug prohibition laws were tied to racism against Chinese immigrants. As one of the first major waves of Chinese immigrants came to the United States around this time, there was a racist moral panic around opium dens in that, immigrant communities did have some opium dens. There was a lot of concern that white Americans would enter into these opium dens and become corrupted. And this became part of the larger racist backlash against Chinese immigrants that led to things like the Chinese exclusion policies that led to one of the first times in the United States history where immigrants were actually, an entire ethnicity of immigrants were banned from coming to the United States, as well as a larger depiction and narrative of Chinese immigrants as this sort of like invading horde that's going to take over the country. I think, given current events, given the anti-Asian hate crimes that have taken place in the U.S. and in various other countries, and the rise in anti-Asian racism, this is something that I think this is a story that we kind of keep telling throughout history. And so I became really fascinated with that relationship. How is it that drug policies and moral panics around drugs become racialized? How does that lead to certain kind of policy outcomes and social outcomes? And how is that impacting the conversations that we're having around drug policy? So given that this is a moment of a lot of reform, there are all of these conversations taking place, going back all the way to like the 1980s, about why we should reform our drug policies, what should be happening, how should we treat drug use and drug misuse as a society. And so I collected a large database of newspaper articles of basically any time that I could find in newspapers going back to the early 80s that people were talking about the war on drugs or, drug policy. And I also looked at about, 3,000 internet comments on articles more recently. So, and by the way, I would not recommend reading 3,000 internet comments to anyone unless you can publish a book about it. But I tried to really look at what's going on in the contemporary debate. There's a pretty established historical record of these relationships that I just mentioned, the racialized moral panics. But what's going on right now, especially as we're increasingly identifying not simply drug use or drug selling or drug misuse as a social problem, but we're increasingly identifying the war on drugs and certain strategies of drug policy as a problem. And what I found was really interesting is that a lot of the narratives that were used earlier to rationalize the war on drugs were still a pretty big part of how even drug reformers rationalize or make the case for reforming drug policies in the United States. So arguments that legalizing drugs would be necessarily good because it would get rid of the black market, and then using a lot of racial stereotypes to associate drug use and drug crime with people of color, even though the rates of drug use are the same across racial groups, and the majority of drug dealing and drug selling and importing in the United States has been done by white people. It was something that was really interesting. And on top of that, I also noticed that there seemed to be an overall, what I call a racial silence in the debate, meaning that even though we do have this historical record, legal scholars, sociologists, historians have been studying this for so long and established these connections. In the debate itself, there was kind of an aversion to talking about racial inequality, and particularly going beyond just saying, hey, there's clearly some disparity or outcome, which really opens up people's interpretations to say, well, maybe there's a disparity in who's getting arrested and incarcerated for drug crimes that reflects, racist stereotypes about who's committing these crimes to begin with, or who's more likely to use drugs. And so what I really thought was missing from this conversation is all of the evidence that, has mounted that it's actually oppression and discrimination and targeted policing practices that has actually led to this relationship between the war on drugs and the continuation of racial inequality. So that's really what the book deals with is not only the history, but also like the current debate and some of its implications.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
Yeah, British listeners might be aware of a moral panic study by a researcher called Jock Young, which was at the end of 60s, early 70s. It's on a similar line, actually. It's about marijuana users, where a lot of people used marijuana at the time, but the rest were much more likely to happen at Notting Hill Carnival, which was predominantly a festival for people of colour. This is perhaps a really difficult question then, Michael. If drug use it transcends lots of different races, lots of different cultures, how does it get pinned or attached or stereotyped to a particular race? How does that occur?
I think there's always a process of essentially punishment and enforcement, taking a few different influences that all kind of feed into that targeting. I think the first one is when we think about the production of images and stereotypes. I often think about this concept from the sociologist Patricia Hill Collins, where she talks about controlling images. And controlling images are basically imagery or narratives that become associated with a particular group that tend to make the oppression or mistreatment of that group appear as though it's natural or it's a product of the inherent traits of that group. And I think whether we want to get fully into the idea that these are, intentionally created to try to justify or rationalize inequality, or we could even take a more structural approach and say, well, if the majority of media producers are elite and are upper-class capitalist males, then they're going to be bringing their assumptions and biases to media production. And also kind of an insight that I got from Stuart Hall is the idea that there is a relationship between the media and major institutions that have a lot of power. So it's not necessarily like a conspiracy theory, but if someone wanted to write a news story about drug policy or about a policy issue, they're likely to turn to the government, they're likely to turn to the police, they're likely to turn to other established and powerful voices, rather than turning to maybe community members or turning to people who've experienced these issues, or even very critical academics. And that's obviously going to influence the depictions of drug problems, is those assumptions. I also think that there is the potential for blowback. One of the questions that I like to ask undergraduate students when I'm talking about this is saying, on our college campus, if you wanted to find drugs, where would you look? And a lot of them, I think, would say, in a fraternity, for instance. This is where there's a lot of wealthy students, a lot of students who are in college because they want to party. I'm sure there's a lot of equivalents in other universities and colleges of these kind of party houses or party spaces. And the question becomes, why aren't those houses regularly targeted for drug enforcement? And I think the big answer here is that there is a lot of blowback or a lot of potential for scandal and controversy that comes along with that. So essentially, if police officers, if the government were to be targeting influential and powerful people, it would be more likely that their budgets would be in jeopardy. It would be more likely that they would face lower rates of conviction due to the amount of resources embedded in those communities. And overall, it would be harder to really enforce those laws. So I think what happens is there's a sort of perverse incentive for the government and for policing to target communities that have less social, political, and economic capital, simply for the fact that it's easier to get higher rates of arrest. It's easier to infiltrate communities, punish them, enact violence against them, because there's less of a, unfortunately, there's less of a blowback. There's less of a potential for consequences for those authority figures. And I think, this is definitely kind of a two-pronged thing that we've seen. And then I also think that there is broadly an interest alignment that takes place where not only can people keep these systems going, but politicians can obviously use demonizing racial and ethnic groups to get elected, as we've seen over the particularly, the past few decades in Europe and the United States. And I also think that there's a lot of industries that spring up, particularly around these types of systems. So like the drug testing industry, the private prison industry, the manufacturers that are producing equipment for police, the media industry that really capitalizes on certain depictions of crime. I think all of these things are kind of working in tandem. I don't think they're necessarily like actively coordinating, but I do think that, this is another issue that does relate back to racial inequality in the sense that if the communities, particularly Black and Latinx or Latino communities, had similar forms of resources, similar political influence as other communities in the United States, they would not be targeted because they would be able to push back as hard as elite, wealthy white communities are. So I think all of these all of these variables are at play. And, I think it's interesting to kind of unpack all of them and how they relate to one another.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? If you watch, of course, they're pieces of fiction, but if you watch something like Breaking Bad or Ozark or something like that, it's really interesting because what you're describing is absolutely accurate, that often the middle class, higher status do not get targeted or even suspected, but the people that are actually pushing the drugs or doing the street selling, those are the ones that are going to be targeted and therefore arrested and also appear in the mass media as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was actually a recent scandal. I actually live in Brooklyn, so I've been paying attention to sort of New York-based issues specifically. And the New York Police Department recently had a pretty big scandal where there was a number of officers of color who actually, they sued the New York Police Department. There was a class action lawsuit claiming that they had been basically told to enforce certain quotas, that they need to get a certain amount of arrests, and that the easiest way for them to get those arrests would be to target ticketing and arrests towards low-income communities of color in New York. So I do think that there are a lot of, even if individuals involved in these systems, let's say someone who is a media producer or a police officer or a government official, even if maybe they don't even personally hold animosity, there are all of these incentives that are kind of baked into the system. And I also try to remember that, as you mentioned, I think the media is a pretty big part of this because the people who are enforcing and creating laws are not immune from the stereotypes and depictions that we see in the media as well. So even they're being influenced. And there's a lot of research that if people don't have immediate contact with a particular group of people or with a particular experience, they are much more likely to draw on even fictional media depictions for the way that they imagine and think about those issues. So it's somewhat understandable that there would be kind of this feedback loop that we could see.
It makes sense. And so that kind of brings us on to another project you're working on about grassroots democracy and racial inequality. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So that is an ethnography that I conducted for my dissertation. I actually made life a little hard for myself during graduate school because I was both conducting this large-scale content analysis of media that led to this book while also doing an ethnography. It has definitely led to me having a lot of opportunities to get my work out there. But basically, I've been really fascinated with the role of grassroots political organizations, particularly progressive organizations in the United States, organizations that maybe aren't represented by one of the major parties like the Democrats or Republicans, but that tend to be pretty decent at organizing in local politics and tend to have really active participants. I think a lot of times, we idealize, I think, as sociologists, and I think as people who are commentating on political issues, there's a real tendency to romanticize and idealize grassroots movements that, when we think about a really sticky social problem, it's like, okay, grassroots movements are really where people are going to take action and where change comes from. And I don't think that's entirely wrong, but I do think that sometimes we're missing the bigger picture when we just sort of idealize or romanticize that. So what I've been really looking at is what are the difficult scenarios that grassroots progressive organizations that are set up organizing around progressive issues like economic inequality, racial justice, feminism, ecological soundness, anti-war, these sort of progressive positions. How do they deal with the fact that there is racialized political inequality, even at the very local level, even at the space where we tend to think of, okay, local politics is kind of this space where anyone can get involved, everyday people can just show up, in a town hall and talk to elected officials and shape policy. But what I found is that, there's barriers to participation, even in these really open seeming kind of moments of local grassroots organizing. And in particular, the organizations that I studied it's probably about 3 or 4 different local chapters of a larger progressive grassroots organization that are extremely predominantly white. And I began to wonder sort of why they became predominantly white organizations. And one of the things that I really came to understand is that when we're talking about democracy and we're talking about grassroots organizing, I think a lot of people tend to think of it as this very strategic, rational process. People are seeking to attain these electoral goals or to have some kind of influence, and they're really just adapting the best strategies possible to do those things. And I think particularly when we're thinking about successful organizing campaigns, I think that's an effective way of thinking about it. But what I really came to notice, watching people in their day-to-day lives, watching people in their daily routines and the conundrums and paradoxes that they were navigating, is just how much our day-to-day habits, our comfort zone, really plays an impact on how organizing works at that level and how democracy works at that level. So there were a number of assumptions that participants would make about their community, for instance, overestimating the white demographics in their community as a way of naturalizing the demographics of their organization to say, well, we really can't have a diverse or racially inclusive organization because, we live in a white city, which, when you actually look up the demographics of these places ends up not being completely true. Or just even the way that people think about space. In the United States and as well as, many places in the UK, there is a massive relationship between race and space where communities tend to be pretty highly segregated. And because of that, a lot of the assumptions that these grassroots activists were bringing to their work was reproducing those dynamics. So it could be as simple as a decision about where are we going to hold the next meeting? What time should we hold it? That's going to inherently make it inaccessible to a lot of people, and it's going to be based on their assumptions about what's normal. So what I really wanted to do is highlight this role of everyday routines, everyday practices, and racial consciousness. How much are people aware of the relationship between their experiences, their habits, and their identity with the overall broader context of racial inequality and racial oppression? And how does that impact some of these outcomes that we're observing? How does that create barriers, but also possibilities for doing grassroots politics in a way that can be really effective at having, larger movements, having more impact, and cross-cutting across groups so that it's not so fragmented.
I was just listening to actually a podcast with Christopher Rufo, who was saying that the majority of, I'll be interested to see if you agree with this, Michael. He said the majority of kind of demonstrations, protests, activism and so on are kind of bourgeois causes, because actually the people that are truly at the bottom of society are more worried about issues like how am I going to eat and pay my bills? I don't know to what extent you kind of agree with that.
I think that there is definitely organizations that become fractured in that way, or they have a certain path dependency that makes it so that they're more accessible to middle-class people. I think in certain communities, the people who are most active just because of those structural barriers, you know, the amount of time and resources, and I think this has been studied by political sociologists quite a bit, that, you know, there is definitely time, money, resources that tends to translate to people having, you know, the space in their day-to-day lives, as well as, you know, the extra resources to get involved. I don't know that that's necessarily true across the board. I think that there have been really amazing and impactful movements that were about organizing working class and poor people. I think particularly in the United States, I think of movements like the Black Panthers, the Poor People's Movement that was organizing around the time towards the end of Martin Luther King's life, rainbow coalitions of various kinds that brought together poor and working class whites with poor and working class Black and Latino organizations. But I do think there tends to be sort of a fragmentation that takes place where certain movements and certain groups and certain organizations do tend to be kind of exclusive and not able to really do the work to kind of have active inclusion of people that are perhaps even most impacted by the issues that they're organizing around. And I think that becomes one of the major barriers for a lot of organizations. If the people that are actually most impacted by a problem don't have a prominent voice or prominent role in the decision making and strategizing and you know, thinking about what do we want to do, how do we want to set this up, then it's probably going to be less effective. So I don't know that across the board there's that you know, protest movements are inherently bourgeois, but I do think that there are definitely some lessons we can take away from just some of the forms of exclusion, the barriers, as well as how we think about, you know, who's able to get involved and what that looks like. I think that if anything, it's more like a cautionary tale than an inevitability. Yeah,
I just wondered if essentially the fragmentation is more about wealth than other factors. I know wealth and ethnicity obviously go hand in hand, but I just wonder if it's essentially is it a social class issue that we're talking about here?
I think there's definitely, as you mentioned, there's a relationship. I would say that there's definitely sort of an intersection of race and class that tends to impact these issues. And it becomes really difficult to untangle, I think, that relationship. You know, I've been increasingly fascinated and interested in this concept that comes out of the Black radical tradition in the U.S. and Caribbean that really focuses on this idea of racial capitalism, that capitalism is at the same time producing these class statuses, but it's also deeply entwined with there being some type of racial hierarchy and some type of racial division in geography. So I do think that, you know, it's not always, I think, productive to try to say, is it this or this? I tend to think of things as being pretty multi-causal, but I think that there's definitely a class component baked into it when we just think about the sheer amount of resources. A lot of people that tend to get involved, particularly with certain organizations, I was actually surprised how many of them came from one of two demographics. One was people who are retired, because, I mean, I think that's kind of obvious in the sense that they have so much free time. They're looking for something to get involved in. They want to have some personal meaning, as well as college students who, you know, maybe are somewhat idealistic or, you know, still have a sense of they're learning all these new things about the world, and they really want to engage in some change work. But we can already see there's definitely a class status associated with both of those groups of people that I think we could definitely point out. The ability to retire and just kind of say, okay, what do I want to do with the rest of my life? I guess I'll get involved in this cause.
Yeah,
that's a position of privilege, and that's going to obviously impact the assumptions. I think related to that, one of the things that I also noticed is that it impacts people's motivations for getting involved, and this also is reproducing a lot of the outcomes in terms of how effective movements are as well as how inclusive they are. A lot of the participants that I talked to that were white and middle or upper class tended to see their involvement in grassroots political organizing as being driven by a personal sense of meaning making. They really saw it as part of what makes them a good person, part of what makes them, people who can feel like they're engaging in good moral work. And it was much less about, actually uplifting a community or changing the material conditions, and much more, like I said, about meaning making, filling that gap of like, I need to feel like I'm doing something important and productive. Versus, there were still an amount of people of color in the organization that I was able to talk to, and people from particularly working class backgrounds who were of color, who espoused completely different motivations for their involvement, which was much more grounded in improving the material and social conditions in their communities, because they recognized that those ethnic communities were actually, real human beings who are being deeply impacted. And so a lot of the fragmentation and clash and even conflict that I observed within these organizations, I think was around that. People's motivations for getting involved, I think, is going to impact a lot of their underlying assumptions and even the question of like, why are we doing this? If people aren't on the same page, that's going to shape what the organization does. So that was definitely something I noticed as well.
Thank you, Michael. We're slowly running out of time, so I wondered if you could perhaps let the listeners know how they could find out more about your work, how they could get in touch, add you on Twitter, etc.
Absolutely, yeah. Please feel free to add me on Twitter. It's basically just my name, @Michael Rosino. Luckily, there's not a lot of other Michael Rosino, so I was able to snatch that up. My personal website is michaelrosino.com. Once again, a benefit of not having a super common name. And my book, Debating the Drug War, is out now. It's really intended for classrooms and students. It's meant to be accessible. It has a glossary. It has a lot of discussion questions. So instructors and students, I think, would be a great audience for it, and I think would really get a lot from it. But thanks for having me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time today, Michael. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.